Latest.
Chris, this is the first time we've been in this studio since we were sat here with Keir Starmer on Friday.
Hello.
How are you doing?
How are you?
Nice to see
Nice
you.
to see you.
You're right. How
All
are
right.
things?
You good?
Yeah. Welcome
Welcome
to
to you.
Newscast.
Nice to see you.
Indeed, that was the very chair in which the Prime Minister was sitting, wasn't it? And here we are again to... Well, it's funny, actually, since then, he popped up, didn't he, talking to Henry Zeffman on...
Well, yeah, he just randomly came out of the door of number 10 Downing Street and plonked himself on BBC Breakfast.
Almost randomly, and there was a little bit of planning that went...
Oh, okay.
But,
it looks a bit random,
Well,
that's
yeah,
why.
no, it did. And I think this is a little bit of their kind of new media strategy of trying to put the Prime Minister out there a little bit more and take on things that he might not have done in the past, whether it be a podcast or popping up on Breakfast TV. Not that he's never done either of those things before, but it seems to be a little bit of a nod towards how they might be tweaking things.
And if you want to listen to the podcast episode from the weekend where me and Chris spoke to Keir Starmer, that's available on BBC Sounds now. And actually, it wasn't just that day's news we were talking about. He said a lot of stuff about what it's like settling into number 10 Downing Street and what his priorities for the budget are. So it's still worth listening to that. It's not entirely a historical episode. And Paddy, I'm just remembering, didn't he sort of call into Broadcasting House one Sunday morning?
Yes, basically we did nudge him and his team, but he had told the Sunday Telegraph that Margaret Thatcher was a Prime Minister of great status. And so he had put her up there as an influential Prime Minister. And of course, we rang him and said, do you need people who voted for Thatcher to vote for you? And he said yes. So I think
there we go. And Stephanie Flanders from Bloomberg is here, who also interviewed the Prime Minister this week. But I mean,
we're the only ones, it should be said. You know, it's not like he's interviewed with everybody.
Well, I can see why he wanted to speak to you, though, because he wanted to speak to the finance bros, didn't he? Because it was about investment.
I was at the investment summit. So yeah, there was a sort of the 12 minutes of gold from him at the investment summit when he was trying to sort of talk up everything about the UK. All good fun.
And of course, Bloomberg has wider audiences than just the finance bros, just to be clear. Anyway, right now, watch us interviewing each other about this week's news on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast
from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And Chris in the Newscast studio.
And Paddy next to Chris in the Newscast studio.
And we're joined by our old BBC colleague Stephanie Flanders, who's now head of economics and politics at Bloomberg. And you host your own podcast, which is...
Yes, currently Votonomics, which is a spin-off from Stephanomics, which in some ways started on the BBC.
Of course, yes. I mean, I always think of the financial crisis when we catch up.
I know, I have that effect. I have that effect on people. People are like, oh, good, there's bad news coming up.
But isn't it interesting, though, that when we were coming up for a budget and a spending review, but people are still talking about the effects of the global financial crisis, which was sort of started in 2007.
It is amazing. But unfortunately, especially if you're an economist, there's just an awful lot of charts that head down or go flat after 2007, including the one that's, for the size of the economy. It's about a third smaller than it would be if we just carried on the happy path we were on, happy path we were on before 2007. So it is a bit of a landmark.
Right, we're going to talk about the public finances, but Chris, there's two things we need to separate because it's all getting a bit smooshed in together, and I suppose it is actually smooshed in together. There's the budget, which will be on the 30th of October, Rachel Reeves' first one, but there's also going to be the spending review where the government sets out the spending plans for government departments for the next financial year. Yep. So let's do the second one first because that's the one that's been making lots of news about the last few days.
Yeah, so you've got a whole load of new cabinet ministers and ministers in a party that's not been in government for a long time, who've arrived in government departments and are trying to work their way through them and understand them, and then assemble what their budgets might look like, or so they hope, for the next financial year. So starting in April of next year, there'll be a further spending review next spring that'll account for the 2 financial years beyond that. But the government had concluded that there wasn't time to do those in the first roughly 6 months of their time in government. So all of that is going on in the context of the budget as well, coming up in just under a fortnight, and an anxiety, which we've now heard about publicly from some cabinet ministers, about what they perceive to be, and the reality is for some of them, a squeeze because of the choices that the government is making, and indeed the public finance inheritance that they are taking on. And you can hear and feel that anxiety. And meanwhile, you've got the Chancellor and her team trying to wrestle with what they do in the budget. One thing I can tell you, and it's not a surprise this, but it's just something we've managed to piece together from the various folk that we are talking to, the government is planning to raise more money from inheritance tax. They're looking at the range of exemptions and reliefs that exist within inheritance tax. I think they'll make an argument when they make that announcement, and I don't know which of those reliefs and exemptions they are going to change, to be clear about what we don't know. I think they'll make an argument when they make the announcement that that is in keeping with their idea of the people with the quote-unquote broadest shoulders picking up a disproportionate amount of the tab, if you like. And no doubt in the next fortnight, as is de rigueur in these processes, we will get little more, a few more little dribbles, either from official sources or unofficial ones, about what they're up to.
Oh, a bit of breaking news on Newscast. Let's pick up on your point there about inheritance tax. It's a weird tax, though, isn't it, Stephanie? In that it's much bigger in people's minds than it actually is in the Chancellor's Red Book.
It doesn't raise an enormous amount of money, and very tiny proportion of estates of people who die. Actually, they're people who inherit any of the money from them end up paying inheritance tax, and yet, for whatever reason, it is the most unpopular tax out there. When you poll voters, it is universally hated. And that has just been a challenge, particularly for left of centre governments over the years, because they talk a good game about equality of opportunity. And what's the greatest violation of equality of opportunity? It's getting loads of money inherited from your grandparents or your parents. And that is the one thing that even supposedly very left-wing people, when they talk to, they want to give money to their kids, and certainly voters all want to give money to their kids, even if there isn't very much prospect of them having any.
I think about the last stats I was looking at today, the last published stats suggest that 4% of deaths end up becoming liable for inheritance tax. So it's a very small number.
But what is interesting about what you said about what they're looking at, apart from just the fact they're looking at it at all, is that it would be about changing the exemptions. Now, that to me sounds like potentially some quite technocratic changes to the details. Now, will Rachel Reeves want to be emphasising the small technocratic nature so as not to scare the horses? Or will actually Rachel Reeves want to go the whole hog and go, we are putting inheritance tax up because rich people need to pay more and we're different from the previous law?
When I say, just to be totally clear about what we do and don't know here, I don't know whether it'll be just within the scope of exemptions and reliefs or potentially broader than that. But I think it will extend to the exemptions and reliefs.
It's like it also goes to, we have had years, and this is under the last 15 years, 14 years of government as well, of more and more exemptions, a messier and messier tax code. So there is a chance that she will be trying to present, even if she's raising a lot of money from some of these changes, she will also be saying, look, I'm bringing some sanity to this system, which rewards people who have rich accountants and can fiddle around all these loopholes and all these exemptions. And that might also, if you get rid of loads of exemptions, you don't have to raise the headline rate quite so much because you're getting a lot more around the edges. So I think that's probably why it'd be attractive.
And of course, Paddy, inheritance tax is sort of like this third rail through British politics, to use a little transport metaphor, because there was a general election that was going to happen under Gordon Brown, potentially, that then didn't happen because George Osborne, when he was Shadow Chancellor at the Conservative Party conference, made a big pledge about abolishing it. And that scared Gordon Brown so much, he cancelled the leaflets, cancelled the billboards.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely the case that we are dealing with the chess-playing Chancellor. And there's a lot of moves that have been played before by chess players, if you think about it. You go out there, you say how awful it's going to be. The ministers set their pieces out saying they don't want anything done. Then you set the cat among the pigeons with inheritance tax. I can remember a Conservative briefing in one of their elections. We're going to lift most people out of paying inheritance tax. And in the newsroom we were saying, as Chris has just pointed out, well, most people don't pay inheritance tax already. So I would say, in my sort of metaphor, that there she is. She's a master chess player, but she's played a few moves wrong in the eyes of her own party with this big gap between the election and the budget and the spending round.
I suppose it's worth making the big picture point as well, which is more Stephanie's turf than mine. But ultimately, if as a government you say you're not going to change the main rates of income tax and VAT and employee national insurance, your really big levers from which, if you choose to, you might decide politically you can't, but if you choose to, you can fairly cleanly generate quite a lot of money into the Treasury. If you have boxed those off because you said you're not going to do it, and instead you are in the, relatively speaking, tinkering in the margins. There's that whole thing about whether you can generate enough money. And then secondly, the whole question of whether you end up building in all sorts of weird, perverse incentives for this, that or the other as a result.
No, and that is why you've also had, it was interesting that even there you changed what you said they had pledged to. So just talking about employee side of national insurance contributions, even in the space of 3 or 4 days, that our understanding of that pledge has changed.
Yes.
And you could still get serious money if she really decided to just tough it out and raise the employer side of national insurance contributions. There isn't an enormous difference between them from an economic standpoint. But, politically, obviously, it's pretty challenging.
What I don't quite understand about that potential change to get employers to pay national insurance or higher rates of national insurance, or is it just actually it would be on the contribution to their employees' pension schemes that employers make? What difference that could make to me as the employee? Because like the basic thing, the first thing you learn about tax is that they're always paid by somebody, even if they're not necessarily aimed at you. So is it that what my employer might make smaller pension contributions, or my employer might pay me less, or how does
it
that
could be
actually
either
work?
of those, and they would both affect you either long term or short term. And I think I was surprised to hear on the pension contribution side of it, because I can see why that would be quite a lot of money, and in some ways it makes some sense.
Some people say £60 billion a year.
But the fact that it's so much tells you that it's going to be painful for quite a lot of people. And it could also mean that there's quite a significant change in people's behaviour, certainly in companies' behaviour, to give people fewer pension contributions. So I think that one is a difficult one to sell. I mean, it's less of a breach of the pledge, but I do think it's a challenge, because you're supposed to be in favour of people's savings more, and we certainly should be in favour of people's savings more.
They're certainly leaning now on the part of the sentence in the manifesto that referred to the impact on quote-unquote working people around their promise on VAT, national insurance and income tax, which I think they will try and claim, or are trying to suggest, is a distinction from the employers. But you could be a small employer and regard yourself as a working person.
Yeah, I mean, it's already got the feeling of hard-working families about it, because there's this sort of painting in primary colours means we're going to go, we're not going to hurt hard-working families. Well, can we just go after the lazy families? We never hear anyone really talk about them. And when it comes to, sort of working people, well, even the bosses are working people. So if you're going to tax the rich, who are said to be richer than the working people, who are what's left of the working class, they're working as well. Well,
I think that's the point. You've already said it. Well, it isn't really working people. It's trying to get a sense of working class, or at least that element of it. But no, I mean, look, just from an economic standpoint, we've already gone into tax exemptions. I mean, this is much more fiscally exciting, this conversation, than I was expecting.
Okay.
But and probably too much for a Thursday night. But remember what their problem is, that you had actually £20 billion worth of national insurance cuts. The rate of national insurance for employees was cut by the previous government in 2 rounds by Jeremy Hunt at a total cost of $20 billion a year. And that Labour very quickly said, we're not going to reverse those. Now, in retrospect, that was a bit silly. I mean, just in terms of providing room, at least it was politically very cautious, when you've now got quite a big majority, but you've also lost 20 billion that you could have just said at the time, look, we're going to leave rates where they were last year. We're not going to raise them above that. We just don't think these 2 additional cuts are affordable. And they said that at the time, but they didn't take the next step of saying we're going to reverse them. And I think she's doing everything she can to go back to those, to revisit those cuts that Jeremy Hunt did without actually doing.
Well, and that's the point in the history of chancellors. She's the one who's put red lines all around herself. Because, I mean, the 3 levers that Chris has mentioned has gone. The national insurance, she hasn't done that. She wouldn't go back and reverse that. The best news for her is something which perhaps is bequeathed by Rishi Sunak. I saw Jeremy Hunt tweaking about it. Not tweaking, Xing, which is falling inflation, which could lead to quicker interest rate cuts, which is obviously that's a gift to the new chancellor, isn't it?
That is what we've had, and it's also in that particular month, which affects the future costs of benefits. So yes, it has, at least on the benefits, on the spending side, it will be a gift, and it could be helpful on interest rates as well.
Except don't all the wise observers say that inflation might tick back up again next month and the month after because energy prices are going to go up, and so it's not.
I certainly don't think it's a given that the Bank of England's going to go a lot faster, and those were all the sort of wise economists at Bloomberg are still saying, watch out. But it's possible that you'll get 2 cuts by the end of the year instead of 1. But it's not, in the scheme of things, the kind of money that she's looking at that we've heard about in some of these, in the cuts that we've heard about, it doesn't mean very much.
And Chris, just to go back to where we started, which is the spending review, so the totals for the government departments, do we know which cabinet ministers have kicked up the biggest fuss about what they're going to have to do?
There is a lot of nods and winks and non-denials, but there is a concern among some of those who represent departments that think they may not be in any sense ring-fenced. So what happens, for instance, to the Justice Department, for instance? So, they are worried. They're worried that they think that there's been plenty of squeezing in recent years and there isn't scope for further squeezing. I mean, some of it rings true with these processes come what may, either the makeup of a government or the circumstances they're in. If you're a Secretary of State, it's kind of your job to argue the corner for your department. And part of that, particularly if you're new, will include lots of folk within that department saying, well, I've got to tell you about this minister and I've got to tell you about that. And you're going to be wanting to be seen to sort of argue the toss. What's been interesting today is hearing different takes, depending on who you speak to, about how conventional their methods are. In other words, writing to the Chancellor and to the Prime Minister. Number 10 and number 11 make the argument that they're on the same page. I think, to be fair, it's not always the case, but I think, to be fair, around this stuff, they broadly are. And you've got these ministers who are sort of making their arguments in the hope that they can be sort of listened to. The other thing that is also going on then is wrangles within departments about where money allocated to a department is then spent. It was a sort of debate within rather than between departments as far as budget allocations are concerned. And as I say, just in case you thought that this might all pass under the bridge in the next couple of weeks, it will resume again pretty much straight away because of the conversation that will go on about the 2 financial years beyond 25-26.
And it'll be 2 years, so all the numbers will be twice as big.
Yeah, and
Which
maybe
means the arguments might be twice as
maybe
loud.
the arguments will be exactly.
Yeah.
Well, there already is an example of doubling, because by going on the 20 billion black hole, they then said there's actually 40...
So-called black hole.
So-called black hole, yeah. but they went on the 20 billion. But there's now 40 billion which is being briefed out. So, of course, in a way, by putting a number on the problem so early, without the budget coming, because we're still waiting for October the 30th, this huge gap, which has been criticised by Alistair Campbell, prophet of the 97 Blair government. Don't wait so long, because with all of you people stoking your podcasts, going on and on about what's in the budget, just get on with the budget. That's what he said.
Paddy, you know you're on this podcast too.
I'm doing my best.
But that was the problem with this summit as well, that it was happening this week because of a promise that probably none of us remembered, that the Chancellor had said she would have it within 100 days. And yet none of the business people who were doing the big deals on Monday could be assured of anything in the budget. They didn't know what their tax situation, they didn't know what the capital gains situation was going to be. And it just, I asked the Prime Minister about this, I didn't get a very straight answer, but it just seems like an odd one to have really wanted to stick to that pledge and therefore made the mood music around that summit even harder.
It's back to this thing about the sort of ridiculousness of the concept of 100 days, isn't it? Because it wouldn't have, if they'd said in the election campaign, we promised to hold a summit within 120 days, 125, or I don't know, the first 4 months or whatever.
28 days or your money back.
Or this calendar year, before the end of the year. That'd have been, I don't think anyone would have said, well, that's not soon enough.
Also,
and then it could have been after the budget.
Also, and couldn't they have had? The budget within 100 days would have made some sense. It was just.
But also, I think that we're accused. Podcast people are accused,
including
me, of process over policy. And the investment summit, which you were sort of queening the Prime Minister about, did bring in 60 billion. Unless that's been tweaked like the fiscal rules are about to be, that's a massive achievement. That they shouldn't be swamped with the noise about how what's going to happen to IHT or capital gains tax. That's a massive amount of money for a new government to be attracting.
No, I think that's right. Of course, it depends on, you never know what these numbers mean, how many deals had already been done, what's being kind of added up together in order to make these numbers. But no, you're right. It should have been just a clean event that was part of moving forward with this Britain that we kind of knew more about, this new government that we knew more about, because the big the big lines had been drawn in the budget.
Right, let's talk about something else. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, is off to China for a couple of days, and that was one of the questions that Rishi Sunak asked Keir Starmer about at Prime Minister's Questions.
Mr. Speaker, this week, China has carried out unwarranted, aggressive and intimidatory military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. Our allies are rightly concerned. After worrying reports that the government may have intervened to stop a visit to the UK by the former Taiwanese president, can the Prime Minister confirm that the Foreign Secretary will use his meetings in Beijing this week to condemn China's dangerous escalatory acts in the Strait?
I thank him for his question. The continued military activity in the Strait is not conducive to peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits is in all of our interest. On the wider point that he raises, we will cooperate where we can as permanent members of the UN Security Council, issues like net zero, health and trade, compete where we have different interests, but challenge, the point he makes is absolutely right, where it's needed, to protect national security, human rights and our values, and we will put that challenge in.
So, yeah, so it's the government's China policy to be like pro-China and anti-China and neutral on China all at the same time.
It's not quite how the Foreign Office would put it, I don't think. But I mean, broadly...
my diplomatic career thwarted.
Yeah, but I think kind of broadly, yes, really, which is that... And there is a parallel, I think, here broadly with where the previous government was, which was we've got to talk to China, we've got to engage with China, we've got to be sceptical about its broader aims. There's usually a tying in knots going on about the exact language that will be used to describe it. Is it a strategic challenge or is it a strategic threat, etc., etc.?
An epoch defining.
Exactly, all of that. And we saw James Cleverly, the former Foreign Secretary, go out to Beijing with some Conservatives at the time suggesting that was a mistake and others saying, no, you've got to be pragmatic. And here goes David Lammy at just the point that there's this tension, or this latest tension in the Taiwanese Strait. So, I mean, I think the argument I hear from those in government, is they've got to maintain that conversation, because what's the alternative to not talk to them?
Although I think there is a difference just from the economic standpoint, because they had, I think it was 2019, the previous government had actually halted this sort of high-level economic dialogue with the Chinese. I'm not sure the Chinese would have missed it very much, but there was a sort of consultative group that was a sort of official level economic cooperation with China. That was stopped in 2019 when, you remember, the Chinese imposed that national security law on Hong Kong, which took away a lot of freedoms, including free press in Taiwan. And the signs are that maybe not this week, but after the Foreign Secretary's trip, there is quite a desire to restart those talks, that dialogue. So there's a shift in that. They're also trying to get the Shein, they're very keen to get the big Chinese retailer to list in the UK. So I think there's a few things like that. And there is, the timing is awkward, because this week you have the Chinese army, I think for the first time, openly admitting that this big exercise is practicing a blockade of the key ports of Taiwan, which is pretty extraordinary.
Well, I mean, David Cameron had a pint with President Xi in the Cotswolds not long ago, and it's a reminder for newscasters of how much has changed in the world order, how quickly the alignment between China, Russia, North Korea, and effectively the weakening of America. There was a president in America only a few months ago who couldn't remember the president of Ukraine or the president of Russia. That's how...
We could remember the names, just not which countries are the presidents.
Okay, which one was which? He knew the names. I'm playing all the right notes.
Just in the wrong order. Yeah.
But I mean, this is weak. Weak America is a story.
And the other extension from that point you make about the pint, that David Cameron and the pint of the Chinese Premier, not that long ago. During the election campaign, I was talking to Douglas Alexander, now newly reinstalled as a government minister. And I asked him, he was out on the campaign trail, about how it felt campaigning in this general election, as was a few months ago, with 1997. And he made the point, just to talk about how the world has changed in a generation, that back then the UK economy was bigger than China's.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, yeah. Things have changed quite a bit. I wasn't quite anticipating such a macro point that he would make as we walked down the street in Preston Pans. But that's where we got to, you know.
But I always think back to that period of, when Theresa May was Prime Minister and then Boris Johnson's Prime Minister. And whenever I was covering stories about China as a political correspondent at Westminster, it felt at least as much about what was happening in the Conservative Party as what was actually happening in the giant tectonic plates shifting in the world. And it's almost like Ian Duncan Smith was as important to what the UK did as Xi Jinping was. And like Ian Duncan Smith and Xi Jinping are not equally powerful in the world. Right. And so it's like, and that was Conservative prime ministers with quite small majorities and quite large groups of Conservative MPs who were really, really worried about China and very good at using parliamentary procedure and their power in the the small majority Conservative Parliament to get their way. And of course, that's gone away now. So it'll be really intriguing to see what actually happens when a government just reacts to China as it is, as opposed to reacting to China and what their own backbenchers are kind of forcing them to do. There ends the A-level politics seminar. Right, okay, I'm quite enjoying talking about the rest of the world. 3 weeks to go before the presidential election. Do you think it's a done deal?
It's interesting because, of course, that's what the Democrats are kind of trying desperately not to feel that way. They're also reminding themselves that October's always a time, even when they're ahead, where they tend to panic. But I think there is certainly a concern as people are looking at all these polls. Certainly, if you look at the financial markets, it is considered to be a done deal. I mean, a lot of money in Wall Street is now betting on Donald Trump becoming the next president. But I think you'd have to say, if you were being a sort of proper, statistician, you'd still have to say the polls are too close to call and that things could still go either way. But the mood music is definitely with Donald Trump.
And it's just, I find it as an interested observer from outside that we sort of, you have to know which US election to actually look at because the popular vote sort of doesn't really come into it. And we talk about swing seats in the UK, and there's loads. There's only like 7 swing states in the US, and that's basically all you need to care about. And even then, actually, it's only a few counties, and it's only a few particular voters within those counties that really matter. And at the moment, the polls in those swing states are all kind of within the margin of error. You just don't know.
The other thing I think which hasn't been spoken about, which I'm rather fascinated in, is guess who gets to certify the vote under the Constitution? The Vice President. And Kamala Harris will be the woman in January, the Vice President in January, who'll say who's won in January. Probably on the 6th, I think it is, under the Constitution, the date of the storming of the Capitol. So there's this huge dispute coming, I think, either if it goes against Donald, and the polls say it's going to go for the Donald, and she's going to be the one standing up in the Houses of Congress saying it's gone his way. It is one of those things. It's a sort of test question. So Trump has said that he doesn't want to have anyone in his cabinet who believes that he lost the last election. I mean, you have to kind of agree with him that he actually won the last election. But the other test, which J.D. Vance had to pass, was to say he wouldn't have certified those results. If you remember, the Vice President Pence under Donald Trump on January 6th, under attack, did certify those votes. And J.D. Vance has said several times he wouldn't have certified. And then I get frustrated. He did an interview with the New York Times a week ago where the follow-up question would have been, well, then what would you have done? Like, what was the path that you thought, if you've stopped the clock on January 6th and there's, fixed dates in the timetable, what happens then? And that's what they've never had to answer.
Right, that's all for this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much for joining us. Nice to see you, Stephanie.
Very good to see you all.
Nice to see you too, Paddy.
Thank you.
And Chris, should we get the Prime Minister in again? Leader of the opposition, next president of the US.
Exactly, they're all welcome here.
It's now the law that you have to come on a podcast. Right, thanks for listening to this one. Bye-bye.
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 Newscast from the BBC.